Hello there, my name is Jordan Leroy Hansen, also known as LeDev, and I'm here to talk about cards that I think you should keep an eye out with the upcoming Throne of Eldraine set coming out in a few weeks. Now, some clarifications that I should offer. One, I'm going to talk about cards specifically from the Throne of Eldraine set. I'm going to refrain about talking about cards that are either from the Brawl kits or the pre-release, uh, or not pre-release, black, from the Planeswalker deck specifically. Mostly I'm refraining from the Brawl ones because most people had played the MTG Arena Brawl event, and they kind of have a retrospective understanding of the overall power level and potential of those cards within the standard. I'm going to talk about cards that, for the most part, we haven't played just yet. Also, number two, I'm going to go through all the colors and just restrict to free cards that might have a potential thing to keep an eye on. Now, to be honest, there are multiple cards that, if you want to brew with them, just have fun brewing with them, especially if you pull them from your packs and such. But I'm going to talk about cards that I do think are ones you kind of have to keep an eye out for, either kind of like a fun brew, or might have potential impact in the meta. Potential, the keyword is. There is sometimes where I could be wrong, because my opinion is overall subjective. Also, I'm more like a casual jank brewer, so I'm not really a professional player, so you gotta take the opinion that I'm going to say with a teeny little grain of salt. So keep that in mind. Also, one thing I do want to announce is this upcoming Tuesday, Wizard of the Coast actually sponsored me for participation in the Throne of Eldraine Early Access Streamer event. So they provided me with a free account, which essentially has all the cards from the new set, as well as the cards currently legal and standard. We're going to use that time to actually make some very janky brews. I'm currently in the brewing process as we speak. One of them is actually going to be a fun one where I'm going to try to flean the Legendary Cauldron. We'll talk about that card once we get to it. And also other janky shenanigans, probably some soul type value, knights, and also just pretty much anything that can come up to mind. If there's any cards you want me to kind of brew around for this event, you can leave it in the comments down below. I'll definitely give it a shot if with some insight. But in the brewing process for that, as well as they're going to provide the drafting experience for Throne of Eldraine, so I'm going to participate in that during the stream. I feel like that one's going to be really fun, because from what I've seen from all the cards, this does, even though it might have little impact, or maybe a lot of impact on the current standard format, this set does look like a really fun draft set. There's a lot of good cards for draft, there's some really good kind of like value cards, so I do think, at least for draft, it's going to be a very, very fun draft set. Nevertheless, now that we got all of that out of the way, let us actually talk about the cards that I think you need to keep an eye on for Throne of Eldraine. Let's first start with white. Now in white, the one card that I think you should really keep an eye on, I mean, there's some no-brainer ones like Deafening Silence, going to be really good tech card in Modern. I don't know about Standard per se, unless we get a deck where they try to play multiple instants and sorcery spells. We had Storm decks in the past, kind of like the Wilderness Reclamation shenanigans, so there is a potential that Deafening Silence might be a really good tech card in Standard. But honestly, I think this one has most of its potential within Modern and other Eternal formats, mostly because, honestly, Storm is a popular archetype. People like to play that archetype. Deafening Silence pretty much shuts that down, as well as any potential. It makes the counter battle against control matchups a teeny little bit awkward. So, just by those little interactions themselves, I do think Deafening Silence is definitely a card to keep an eye out of. It's probably going to be a pretty decent tech card, at the very least in Eternal formats, and potentially Standard if we get a deck that wants to cast more non-creature spells during their turn. So, keep that in mind. Keep that out. Besides that, the other cards I would say keep an eye out for is, the second one is Charming Prince. This one is just, the more I look at this card, the more I actually kind of like the card a lot. It's a 2-mana 2/2 bear, which has the ability to choose 1, you scry 2, you gain free life, or, the one effect I like, exile another target creature you own, return to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. Honestly, this is probably one of the more better bears that we actually have seen in a while for Magic. I mean, the factor is, for this card, this actually has the potential in Standard to be beneficial in multiple archetypes. The one I could think of right off the bat is like maybe the life gain one. There's a lot of decks that try to synergize with life gain shenanigans. For example, kind of like the Ajani life gain deck or the Orzhov life gain deck, they might like this card a lot. Also, they sometimes like to play Dawn of Hope in that deck. So the fact that even this is beneficial late game, where you can play this, gain the life, and then just spend like 2 extra mana you have just to draw the card thanks to Dawn of Hope, that's something you got to keep in mind. But even if you don't benefit from the life gain, there's also Scry 2, which helps smooth out your draw, which is actually pretty nice. And the one effect I love the most, though, is the exile another target creature you own, and return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. Now, granted, this is delay flicker. This is not like flicker that we've seen in the past, where it's pretty much make something leave the battlefield and then automatically return it to the battlefield. I think we had a few cards like that in the past. Like the one that I can remember right off the bat that had that effect was Eldrazi Display Certified, if we remember correctly, but that let the creature into the battlefield tapped, which apparently was really good in Eldrazi Tron and all that stuff. But I like this effect because we do have a lot of powerful ETB creatures in the format. The one I can think of right off the bat is probably... Honestly, I think of Risen Reef if you want to go Bant, but there's even stuff within White itself. Like, you can use Charming Prince to be, quite frankly honest, flicker a Charming Prince. And that's kind of cute when you think about it. And there's just the shenanigans where... Actually, the broken shenanigans you can do with that is if you have Charming Prince, well, that's the thing. You can't go, like, infinite with it due to the factor of the beginning of the next instep clause on it. But if you do need to flicker it just so you can either get an additional scry or an additional flicker on another thing to maybe semi-protect your Charming Prince until the opponent's instep so that it doesn't get targeted to removal, potentially, though that's a weird interaction, so probably not. But trust me, when you type into the battlefield, we have a lot of creatures that have ETB effects that are really powerful, both in white. We have the Cavalier Cycle, that's one thing I can think of right off the bat. And really, I could go on and on. So I think the flickering part of this card is actually going to be a lot more powerful than people take at first glance. But still, the other abilities are relevant, and it's a versatile card. And most cards that are very versatile have at least a chance to impact the format. Also, it's a human, so it's something to consider for modern humans. That list is already kind of really consistent enough that I don't think they would add this card per se, but I think they'll at least experiment with it. So, yeah, Charming Prince, keep an eye out for this card. Besides that, this is going to be a hard one. I have to keep myself restricted to 3, so... I think if I had to, and trust me, White has a couple really good cards. Like, I really like Shepherd of the Flock a lot. I like Glass Casket. I like Hush... Well, okay, let me phrase it. I like the fact that we have Hushbringer as a tech card. I don't really like Hushbringer since I like ETB shenanigans, so... And Aristocratic shenanigans, so... I'll say honorable mention will be Hushbringer because it is actually a decent tech card if the meta calls for it. But a card that I would say to keep an eye out for, in my personal opinion, the Circle of Loyalty. I feel like the Circle of Loyalty is one of those cards where I feel like the value you get from it is kind of absurd when you think about it. The Circle of Loyalty. 6-cost legendary artifact. The spell costs 1 less for each knight you control. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever you cast a legendary spell, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. Oh, and free and a white, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. Okay, in my personal opinion, this is the one that's more kind of my jank brain talking, but I feel like this is kind of an absurd card for if we can have it post-rotation, Kefis. I feel like Kefis decks are still going to be a possibility post-rotation, and I feel like Circle of Loyalty will be kind of a card that will at least be in as a 1 or 2 of. Mostly because I feel like the value you generate from that is pretty powerful. 1, it buffs up all your legendary creatures, which is really nice. 2, you are going to cast multiple legendary spells thanks to Kefis' ability, so I feel like you're going to get the Knight tokens without a sweat. And as long as we have a solid enough legendary Knight base within the Absent-based colors, which we have seen a couple good ones, so I do feel like you can get the cost reduction relatively easy. I mean, heck, we have a turn 2 green legendary creature that's a knight that we can actually use, so I feel like that's something to keep in mind. So I feel like the Circle of Loyalty is going to be kind of one of those cards that at first glance you kind of think it's more like a EDH or Brawl card that's mostly for like the Knights decks and such. But I feel like since Kefis is a really popular deck in Standard at the moment. I feel like if it still survives the post rotation, I feel like the Circle of Loyalty is a card to keep an eye out for that deck because I do feel like the incremental value you're going to get from it is kind of absurd. Plus, there's other synergies of cards I can talk about, such as how with the buff you can actually benefit with cards like, say, like for example, I don't know. Let me think. There's one specifically that I remember. Oh yeah, now I remember. The one that you can actually tutor out with Acclaimed Contender, so if you can have a Knight consistent space like a Legendary Absalom deck, you can tutor out for the artifact, which is pretty nice. Or even stuff like with the buffs, you can actually synergize with Harmonious Archon, where since you got the buff from the Legendary Artifact, your creatures are going to be 4/4s, while technically theirs are still going to be free freeze, and it will make trading a lot more tricky. So I feel like this stuff you got to keep in considerate. And that's kind of the thing I kind of liked about with White at the moment from what I've seen. There's a lot of cards that actually kind of synergize with each other in kind of like a Go White archetype. Like you see stuff like Linden and Steadfast Queen and such. And the more I see that, the more I'm kind of impressed with White as a color from the upcoming set. Plus, we also have one of the more decent board whites that's also 7/7 Vigilance, so yeah. Though, my janky heart is saying Shepherd of the Flock, because we're going to talk about an artifact that will bring back this card up, but let's just say I'm keeping an eye on this one. Nevertheless, though, Circle of Loyalty, keep your eye out on this. Now, let's stick to blue. Blue, I think we should talk about the first one that's kind of the talk of the town. Urmi, Looker of the Loch. This is a legendary creature merfolk wizard, 2 and a blue. This spell costs 1 less for each artifact you control. When it enters the battlefield, put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. And tap, choose target artifact card in your graveyard. You may cast this card this turn. You still pay its cost, timing rules still apply. Now, I actually like this card a lot. Now, at first glance, I kind of thought it would be just like a fun, janky brawl, or even kind of like a commander card. Mostly because, you know, you can do like a mono blue artifact deck, and it's kind of, you have a lot of still really good artifacts, as well as the legendary artifacts, so it's like, okay, you can have kind of like a semi-card draw engine with this. The fact that with the cost reduction with artifacts is cute. It's a cute card. But then people start talking, and once I heard kind of like the whispers and such, I kind of realized that this card might have the potential to be a very absurd powerhouse card. Mostly because in Eternal formats. In Eternal formats like Modern, there's a lot of Affinity players that are talking about this card, the potential to actually bring back their stuff that goes to the graveyard. I also seen people considering this for Urzatron, potentially? Keyword is potential. And then there's just also the potential for combo decks, since we do have stuff like Mott's Amber, and also kind of like Mott's Opal, so you kind of can go with a infinite loop engine of some sorts with that. I don't know the exact loop, but there's a loop either in Modern or Legacy that can help you get like infinite mana and such. But even then, I also think this has a chance in Standard, just more for more. Well, to put it in other words, I feel like there's the blue-white artifact deck might actually be a potentially good archetype in Standard, thanks to Urmley the Lurker of the Loch. Because what it does is it allows you recursion of some potentially very powerful artifacts. Like the one, I'm not even talking about the legendary artifacts, I'm talking about just stuff that is, relatively speaking, practical, like Glass Casket. The factor is, if Glass Casket gets milled into your graveyard due to Urmi's effect, no worry, you can just use Urmi's effect to cast it from your graveyard. Or let's say a Glass Casket's already on the battlefield, it gets removed. You can use Urmi then to actually just recast the Glass Casket from the graveyard. So the fact that Urmi allows your graveyard to be your hand, and there's a lot of versatile artifacts that we're getting from this set, as well that's still currently in Standard post-rotation, I feel like Urmley Looker of the Loch is a card to keep an eye on. And I think if the pre-order prices has any indication, I think many people are like, yep, we're keeping an eye on this. Besides that, I think my personal favorite blue card from the set is Fae of Wishes. Now, this one's going to be talking about the artifact we're going to talk about later, but I personally like Fae of Wishes a lot as a constructed card. 1 in a blue, 1/4 flying. You can spend 1 in a blue to discard 2 cards, return this to the owner's hand, but it has the Adventure spell on it, which, for those who have not seen the Throne of Eldraine set, the mechanics, Adventure, basically, what an Adventure card is, you have 2 choices when casting this card. You can either cast the creature portion of it, which then is going to be a 2 mana 1/4, with those abilities on the right. Or you can cast the adventure side of the card, which is considered a instant or sorcery spell. You do have to cast it at the speeds, like if it's an instant card, you can cast it anytime. Sorcery, you can only cast it during main phases unless you have cards that make you cast it with flash speed, aka like Leyline Anticipation or stuff like that. But Granted is a sorcery adventure, and when you cast this sorcery, you do the sorcery's effect, and then this creature goes into kind of like exile, but not like exile you think. It's like an adventure exile zone, which if a creature that gets exiled through an adventure this way, you can then cast the creature portion of the spell. So it's actually really cool. It's like two cards in one. It's kind of like a delayed split card in a sense, where if you can cast one, if you don't mind casting one specific part of the card first, you can later down the road cast the other part of the card pretty efficiently. In Fate of the Wishes, I love the sorcery adventure card of this, which is Granted. Free and a blue, you may choose a non-creature card you own from outside the game, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Now, one of my personal favorite cards from that was currently in Standard but's going to rotate out with Throne of Eldraine was Mastermind's Acquisition. I really love the versatility of that card. It kind of had the same effect where you can look outside of the game for a card to put it into your hand. Now, clarification for people: these wish effects, specifically when you're looking for a card outside the game, there's casual spaces that like to make it where it's like, oh, you can look at your binder and stuff like that. But if you're playing like in a tournament specifically or on the arena client specifically, when they're saying you may choose a card you own from outside the game, they are specifically stating you can choose a card from your sideboard. Many people have still seen this effect that's still going to be staying in rotation thanks to stuff like Karn, the Great Creator, and even the new Vivian from Core Set 2020, so this effect is not it's not something that people are not familiar with, but just to be safe. Still, I like this card because it does allow for some potential janky combo shenanigans, and I love these wishes specifically because for combo decks, it allows you to still have the combo in your deck, but you don't have to go full playset in it, and you can just keep a little pieces of it in the sideboard. So if people try to answer your combo pieces, you can then just use Fae of Wishes, tutor for one outside on the sideboard, and hopefully go off with combos. Or even just general good tech value cards to help you like against certain matchups, like let's say you're going against a burn matchup, hey, we're going to get an artifact that helps us gain life, or maybe a massive gain life spell or something like that. Like little stuff like that. So the potential to use this as a way to get tech cards from your sideboard into your hand and use them, as well as a way to help bring combo pieces. I just love the design of this card. It's just very flavorful since we always called them wishes, so it's fairies that are granting wishes, so. And the factor that it can be recursive with the factor that if you don't mind discarding two cards, bring it back to your hand, that's also really great. So I love Fae of Wishes a lot. I do think it's a card that has potential, mostly because even with the Wish Clause aspect of it, it's still a 2-mana 1/4, which, while it still will die to stuff like Lava Coil per se, I still think that could be some decent defensive stats against an early game aggressive deck. So if you do just need a 2-mana 1/4 if you're a flyer deck specifically, then I think you will consider Fae of Wishes, and late down the line, if you don't need to cast the creature portion of the spell, and you would like more of a powerful card from your sideboard, then cast Granted, and you get it. So, Fae of Wishes, keep an eye out on this. Another card that I would say to keep an eye out for, let's restrict it to free. Honestly, the one that I would say to keep an absolute eye on, and I think people are going to tilt their heads sideways at me from saying this, though I would say this gargoyle is a pretty close one. I think one card that is going to catch people by surprise, Merfolk Secret Keeper. A common adventure spell, so we're going back to the adventure mechanic. It's a 1-mana 0/4, which is but we're not talking about the 0/4. We're talking about the adventure, which is Venture Deeper. Sorcery Adventure. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. Okay, I'm just going to say this right off the bat. Milling 4 cards, either from your own or from an opponent's graveyard, can be significantly powerful. As we've seen stuff like Necromancer's Stockpiler and such in kind of like current standard, and even in modern with stuff like Hogag and such, The ability to try to get a lot of cards into your graveyard is nothing to underestimate. And I do feel like we have incentives as well as with Blue Black Mill, which is an archetype that's been starting to get brewed up a little bit, especially with some of the tech cards that we got in Golden and such for that deck archetype, as well as potential Reanimator shenanigans. This is also a really good card for Reanimator. And even then, the 1 mana 0/4 is not the end of the world. You can just use it as a defensive unit, which I feel like decks that are going to go either in the Reanimator plan or the specific, to be quite frankly honest, the Reanimated plan or the Mill deck, they do want to delay till they get to a Reanimation or a higher power of Mill spells, so this card is also good for that. And even in Reanimator specifically, we have stuff like Blood for Bones where we need a sack outlet to both do the reanimation spell, and Merfolk's Secret Keeper is just a really perfect perfect sack fodder to that. Because then all you can do is just you sack Merfolk's Secret Keeper, you get back like your Agent of Treachery or your Drakaseth or whatever you want to reanimate from the graveyard, and then you can just bounce Merfolk's Secret Keeper to the graveyard to your hand because of the Blood for Bones effect, and then you can just recast the adventure portion of it. So, yeah. I feel like, while there's a lot of powerful blue cards, I do think Merfolk's Secret Keeper is going to be kind of the underdog of the set that once people start seeing the potential of the fact of how much you can put in your graveyard thanks to this card, and the fact that it benefits a lot of multiple archetypes, I think Merfolk's Secret Keeper is honestly one of the more powerful standard cards. And it's weird to say that, because, I mean, it's a 1 mana 0/4. Granted, you still get the top 4 cards of library to the graveyard, but really? Honestly, I say really. Keep your eye out on this. This is one of those cards that looks very unassuming, but I do think it's going to catch people kind of whiplash like that. So, keep your eye out on this. Though, an honorable mention, it's a two-way tie between, personally for me, it's a two-way tie between Midnight Clock, because I do love Midnight Clock, and probably Hypnotic Sprite. But, honestly, also Garrett the Wizen. Mostly because I want to play Garrett the Wizen in Yarok, since it's an ETB effect, so you can draw twice as many cards, but that's beside the point. Anyway, we're going to get to Black. And Black has some interesting cards. Like, Black in the set, I do like some of the cards, but also there's some cards where I'm like, there's some good ones, though. Like, the good one that I think people would be very shocked if I didn't talk about it, Murderous Rider. Murderous Rider is a really, really good adventure card from this set. It's a 3 mana 2/3 with lifelink. When it dies, put it on the bottom of the opponent's library. But why are we playing this? Well, we're playing this because the Swift End portion of this card, which is the adventure portion, that's 1 black for an instant. Destroy target creature or planeswalker, you lose 2 life. So this is Hero's Downfall. And Hero's Downfall, as many people know, was a very, very popular standard card within the Pharaohs / post-Concept Arceus meta. It saw a lot of play, it answered a lot of threats in that mana, and even will still answer a lot of threats in this current meta, since we still have a ton of Planeswalkers, States of War, the Spark, and such. So Murderous Rider, I think, will be a very, very good tech card. Now, granted, we have stuff like Bedevil, but I do feel like Murderous Rider, if you're going into a 2-color deck, I think it's going to be the preferred option. Or I think it's going to be a combination of Murderous Rider, and if you're in Rakdos, a combination of that and Bedevil if you feel like there's problematic artifacts. There is also the potential that Bedevil might just finally go to the sideboard now, and then actually Murderous Rider just sticks in the main board. That's a potential as well. But still, just the fact that you get that adventure portion of the spell, very powerful standard card, as well as getting a 2/3 lifelink helps minimize life loss, which could be helpful against burn matchups and such, so you gotta keep that eye out. Plus, also keep in mind, we might have a way to cast multiple copies of Hero's Downfall. Oh boy, I am foreshadowing that artifact, aren't I? But yeah, we'll talk to that when we talk about that. Nevertheless, still, Murderous Rider, just going to be probably one of the more powerful Black adventure cards in the set. It's just Hero's Downfall, and you get a decent 2/3. So, what more can you ask? Besides that, I think another card that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it. Sir Conrad the Grim. Now, this one, I'm going to cheat and I'll probably add one more card to keep an eye out. Because we did play with this in Brawl, but it's still a card technically from the set, so... And I think Brawl kind of convinced me the power level of this card. Sir Conrad the Grim, 5 mana for a 5/4 legendary creature human knight. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, okay, it's a lot of words, but Sir Conrad deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it has a mana sink ability of 1 in a black that each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. I love this card. I love playing this card in Brawl. It was a fun one, and I also love the fact that we got a playset of this thanks to the Brawl event, because I like this card legitimately a lot. First thing that it comes to mind, this card is actually surprisingly decent in Kefis. I'm not sure if it will stick into a Kefis deck post-rotation, but I do love the synergy here. I love the factor that you can essentially peen whenever you cast cards, legendary cards that are creatures from your graveyard. Thanks to Kefis, which then does the peening ability, you also have ways to mill cards into your graveyard, potentially, thanks to some legendary creatures. So then when those creatures get into the graveyard, you do a peen. And even just stuff like Reanimator. This might actually be just a decent... I'm not sure a Reanimator target, but it's a decent top-in in a Reanimator deck, besides the bombs that you're trying to reanimate, just because the factor you can do minimal peens there. I also think this will be a fun Brawl and Commander card. I just like Sir Conrad a lot. The more I play with it, the more jank I did with it, I feel like it has the potential to do some silly shenanigans in Standard. I'm not sure if it's going to survive Standard, since we do have a lot of efficient removal. And once people see your trick, they're probably going to remove the Conrad just to make sure that they don't get peened to death. But I do think it is a card to at least keep an eye out of. And besides, if you played the Brawl event, you already got a playset of this, so let's actually talk about a card that we haven't played with that honestly kind of scares me. Wishclaw's Talisman. 1 in the black for an artifact. It enters the battlefield with free wish counters on it. And you can tap 1 and spend 1 mana to remove a wish counter from Wishclaw Talisman. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. An opponent gains control of Wishclaw Talisman. Activate this ability only during your turn. Okay, I know I got burned when I recommended Scheming Sabotage as a potential fun standard card. I think Wishclaw's Talisman is kind of a card that, even though it is technically a symmetrical tutor, is something you really gotta be very cautious about in the meta. Here's the reason why. Because with Scheming Sabotage, the reason why... Oh no, it's Scheming Symmetry. That's what it was. Or, I always get the name of that. It's the 1 mana, pretty much, tutor effect. Actually, so that I don't... Sometimes I do brain farts on names, so... Scheming... I think it's Symmetry, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's Scheming Symmetry. So, the reason why Wishclaw Talisman is a lot better than Scheming Symmetry is not only the fact that you get multiple tutors out of it, potentially, you, at the very least, will get 2. There are some people that have been joking that you can actually get free if you do stuff like untap it, then tap it and such, if you have a way to untap the artifact before the opponent gains control of it. True, but I feel like still getting 2 activations out of this is pretty powerful, because one thing to keep in mind that's different from Scheming Symmetry, those cards go into your hand. They do not go on the top of your library. And the amount of tempo that you get from a tutor that goes into your hand to a tutor that goes on the top of your library is very, very significant. Don't underestimate that. It is one of the more powerful abilities that you can do. Plus, the one thing that scares me about this card, and the more I think about it, and the more I did jank brewing with it and such, what actually legitimately scares me about this card is the factor that not only that it can be used to tutor out tech cards to help you against certain matchups that you have in your deck, but the factor that the majority of really good tech cards in the meta currently are Planeswalkers. You see a card that's drawing multiple cards and you need to tutor something to help negate that? Oh, you can tutor out your Narset. Oh, hey, you go against a deck that has a lot of instant interaction? Oh, hey, you can tutor out a Teferi. The mini Teferi that will still stay in Standard. Hey, you see a card, you see them trying to negate your card draw? Oh, hey, you're going to tutor out a Chandler's Fire Artisan. Or, hey, you see a free drop that's really, really problematic? Oh, hey, you're going to tutor out a Vraska. I feel like the amount of potential techs that are planeswalkers that you can tutor out thanks to Witchclaw Talisman is kind of scary. And also, there's even the factor that you can even just put in, like, you can make your sideboard a lot more efficient now because most people, when they go do the sideboard shenanigans, they try to put in like 2 to 3 of the same card that they think will help against a specific matchup. Mostly because they think they're not going to draw into it, or they have to draw into it, especially if they need it for early game tempo. Thanks to Witchclaw's Talisman, you can actually go modify your sideboard where you can have just a one of each kind of a tech card specifically. Just because even if you don't draw it in your early hand, you could be like, oh, I'm going to just tutor it out with Witchclaw's Talisman. No sweat. Also, if you're very concerned about the factor of your opponent getting a free tutor, there are ways to answer it. Like, you can use your third tutor to essentially answer what they're going to answer, which is a weird thing to think about. But there's also cards like Angrath's Rampage, which allows a target opponent to sacrifice an artifact, and as long as they're not an artifact deck, you can make them forced to sacrifice a Witchclaw's Talisman if you think you're going to get more beneficial from one tutor from this. Yeah, I know, this is a very weird way to look at the card, but I do feel like Witchclaw's Talisman has the potential to be a very, very scary card in Standard. There is also potential in Eternal formats, since there's stuff like Twiddle and such, but I think in Standard, this is one of those cards where, if I had to summarize what my fear about this card is just the factor that this could be used to tutor out on tempo planeswalkers, which we have a lot of in the meta, so I mean, imagine this on turn 4 and using this 1 mana and tutor it, say, in Ashiok. Enough said. Witchclaw's Talisman, keep an eye out on it. Besides that, the one Jink card that I am going to try to brew around, the Cauldron of Eternity. 10 black and a black for a legendary artifact, so it's high cost. But it costs 2 less for each creature card in your graveyard. Whenever a creature you control dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. Also, it has a nifty little ability for 2 and a black to pay 2 life and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Oh, and you may activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Actually, now I'm mentioning, I think all the cards I'm saying keep an eye out are from the Legendary Artifact cycle, which is something to consider. Nevertheless, this card, honestly, good if you're trying to do a Reanimator strategy. I can see this as a 1 or 2 of in Reanimator in Standard. But the one premise that I'm actually going to look at this card is actually the factor that is a 12 cost artifact. There are ways with stuff like Heart of the Great Creator where you can make this into a 12/12 creature. And honestly, the Jank brew I'm trying to brew is actually make a 12/12 Cauldron of Eternity so I can fleen it to the opponent's face, because fleen is back in the meta. So it seems like the whole lore of this card is that people are trying to bring back the Cauldron to the Queen and such. Like they're going on quests and such. So I figured, hey, let's bring the Cauldron back to our opponent with a fleen! So yeah, that's kind of my main purpose. It's a very janky deck. I would not say it would have any meta impact, but that's a janky thought of the card. As the actual practical applications, this is just a decent top-end card for Reanimator. Now, the weird thing about this card is the factor that, technically speaking, once this is out on the battlefield, it does make the factor of recurring the threats that you already have on the battlefield a little awkward, since it does have the effect that when this creature dies, it goes to the bottom of your library. However, I do feel like if you put at least enough consistent threats, and we have cards such as like Doom Whisperer, and even like that Merfolk Secret Keeper if we go into a blue-black Reanimator strategy to already mill cards from our graveyard, that I feel like you can still go through the Reanimator deck without much sweat. Presuming people don't tech like Grafdigger's Cage and you feel really sad. So nevertheless, keep an eye on Cauldron of Eternity. Though if there is one thing that might prevent it from seeing play is it's 12 mana. 12 mana is a LOT a lot. And the last card I'm going to mention, just to add a card due to the fact of Sir Conrad, is technically a card we already talked about. That one's kind of a no-brainer. I think one that... which one is one that I think people will underestimate? Honestly... that's a hard one. because all of them are actually relatively decent and they have their practicality. But if I had to make a guess, okay, let's talk about the budget Foxies. Spectre Shriek. 1 black mana for sorcery, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player exiles that card. If a non-black card is exiled this way, exile card from your hand. So, this effect is a very powerful effect. In Standard, with decks being as consistent as they can be, especially with curves and such, you usually appreciate effects such as very early game turn 1 or turn 2 hand disruption cards. Like, the most popular card we have in the moment is Fodder Erasure. Fodder Erasure sees consistent play in control decks that are in blue-black. It's just the factor that you can both... No, granted, the effect of that card is both the factor you do the hand hate as well as the Surveil, which is very powerful. But the factor that Foxies is also a popular card in decks, I think Spectre Shriek will have the potential for control decks to give a shot at. Now, yes, if you are going against a deck that doesn't have black cards in their deck, the factor is you are going to have to exile a card. But I don't think that's much of a cost as people think right off the bat. Now, granted, it would be costly if you were playing this in a deck like Reanimator and you have to exile one of the creatures you want to reanimate, yes. But I feel like in blue-black control, I feel like you're going to do something as simple as, okay, you're going against this one deck that you know your one tech card you have in your hand is not going to work. You're just going to exile that. And hopefully, if you have enough resource generation, such as drawing or even tutors, specifically Witchclaw Talisman, I think it's fine that you're going to exile a card from your hand of your choice. Now, and also the one thing that I think people need to keep an eye on, I think this is going to be one of those that in Constructed, if we're talking about like traditional play, I think this is going to be one of those cards that I'd like to call the you play the first game and you take out. Specifically stating that if you know you're going against a deck that is definitely not have black in it, and then you play your first match, you do your hand disruption, you observe kind of like how the deck works and such, and then you look at your sideboard, figure out your answers, and then you can just take these out because you already know how to answer their deck, so to speak, in a sense, or at least go for that kind of like meta game thought of, what are they sideboarding in? What should I sideboard in? You know, that. And I feel like it's a card that will be just taken out of for the second game, unless if you're going against a mirror match where then Spectre Shriek just becomes a Foxies, and, well, Foxies. Enough said. Still, Spectre Shriek, this card will probably see play in Standard. It's going to be annoying. Just get ready for it. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Okay, now we get to Red. So, the one card that I think I would be remiss not talk about in Red that's actually really, really good. Bone Crusher Giant. 2 in a red for a 4/3 creature giant that has the left side creature portion, or not left, right side creature portion that has, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell, the Bone Crusher deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. And then there's also Stomp, which is the adventure portion, which is 1 in a red. Damage can't be prevented this turn, deals 2 damage to any target. Honestly, this is just a really fine free drop for mono red. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to... It's kind of hard because most people are kind of like saying, oh, this is an auto-include in mono red burn, no sweat about it. The fact that you get the burn portion and you get this creature is nice. Why wouldn't it see play? I do think it will see play, but I don't think it's going to make a ridiculous amount of dent as people think. And the reason why I'm going to say that is, yes, the stats are aggressive. Yes, the factor that Stomp is a really good adventure is nice. However, there is a lot of very efficient removal that we're getting in the set. And yes, the factor that Bone Crusher Giant will answer to that, because the fact is it will deal 2 damage when you remove it, which I don't think people will mind because there is also enough life gain synergy matter cards in the set that I think that's going to be very minute. I still think this is still a powerful card because the factor is Stomp. Stomp is just a really, really powerful adventure when you think about it. Because if we go into a meta where there's fog effects or stuff like that, or even cards like the one thing that people, or even just cards that are just as simple as just prevent like 2 damage or something like that. The factor that I don't think people would play those cards specifically, but the fact that there's also a tech against that if that ever gets popular. Just that effect itself, plus we also have a way to modify it where it deals 4 damage, we're going to talk about that card pretty soon, that I think is actually the better free drop than Bone Crusher Giant. But I do, oh no, it's a 4 drop. what am I thinking? Brain fart. But I do like this card. I do think it will see play, but it's one of those cards that, out of all the cards I'm going to talk about, it's kind of, how to phrase this? I don't know how to say this. It's a card that I think, if it's impactful enough in the meta, yes, it'll see play. But I can also see a very, very slim chance that this card might not. Keyword slim. So keep that in mind. But yeah, what was the other card that I was talking about? The one free drop that does kind of scare me a little bit, though? Ironcrack Pyromancer. This is a card to keep an eye out. 2 and a red, human wizard. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it deals free damage to any target. So one thing you're going to see in red and blue, they have been trying to very encourage the, if you draw a second card, do this effect. So that's is kind of one of the powerful cards they have for that effect, which is, oh hey, if you're ever going to draw your second card, you're going to do a lightning bolt. And that is kind of absurd. Even the factor is, I think what people are not realizing with this card is the factor is we have stuff like Spark Double, or the fact that you can put multiple copies in this deck. This effect goes off multiple times if you have multiple copies. So if you have 2 Ironcrag Pyromancers out, you draw your second card, you're going to do 6 damage and free damage intervals to whatever target that suits your fancy. And I do think that we have enough draw a second card cards currently in Standard that I do think that could be a very consistent threat. I mean, to put in perspective, I won't go into full detail, but legitimately, we literally have Tormenting Voice at instant speed. The factor that this could potentially be 2 mana, do this, draw 2 cards. Oh, by the way, at the end of your opponent's turn, you're going to deal 6 damage because you have 2 Ironcrag Pyromancers out. That has the potential to be very, 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 very absurd. Now, if there is one thing that might make this card not see much play, is the factor is it's a 0/4. Most decks that like to be aggressive like to have aggressive stats. That's kind of like why you see like the Giants seeing a lot more talk than that one, because, oh hey, it's a 4/3. That's aggressive stats. 0/4, on the other hand, not so much aggressive stats. However, I feel like this is one of those exceptions to the rules, because when you kind of think about it, it's kind of like a creature cavalcade kind of card, where if you have the right deck that can synergize a lot from this card, I feel like this is going to deal a lot of burn damage in the future, and it kind of scares me if I'm being quite frankly honest. So yeah, Ironcrag Pyromancer, keep an eye out on this card. It's going to get obnoxious. Also, a card that my janky heart kind of desires to brew around. Let's talk about it. The Fires of Invention. 3 and a red for an enchantment. You can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn. However, you may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana costs. Note is a may, so you gotta keep that in mind. So, I feel like I could go into full details on this. One thing I will mention, Notches, which is a really cool YouTube content creator and streamer, actually made a pretty good video on Fires of Invention. I would say go give him a look. I might even link it in the comments down below, because he did a pretty great video to explain why Fires of Invention can be a pretty absurd card. And honestly, some of the stuff I'm going to be is paraphrasing his video, so if you want to kind of like a full detail of it, I would say go check it. Nevertheless, Fires of Invention just has weird potential to be very, very silly. And the reason why it has potential to be very, very silly is just the factor is the amount of tempo advantage you can get with this card on the battlefield is kind of absurd. Because the thing is, with Fires of Invention, sure, the factor you're restricted to 2 spells is kind of but the factor is you do have ways to actually, we have spells in the meta that can help us bounce this. So we can get 2 free spells. Let's say the second free spell is just a way to bounce Fires of Invention. Oh, when we do that, then we can, if we have enough mana, especially if we use those free spells to cast like land generation spells per se, then we can go off and actually get a lot of tempo advantage over our opponent. Plus the fact that you can use this as just a way to cast. I think the most powerful deck that this is going to be in is maybe like a Super Frenzy type of deck design. Mostly because the factor is most Planeswalkers have a lot of efficient value you get just from casting it for free. And the fact that you can cast 2 of them for free and then just get their value off them is kind of absurd when you think about it. I mean, for example, you can say the one that I think Notch just mentioned, and I will talk about it. You can say cast 1 random Planeswalker, then cast a Teferi. Oh, hey, you use the Teferi, then the bounce Fires of Invention. Now you have all your mana to cast, like, say, a third Planeswalker, or maybe a board wipe, or just... Seriously, the amount of shenanigans this card's going to provide is weird. And the one interaction that I'm going to talk about that's going to be a weird one to talk about, I feel like this card has a weird semi-synergy with Chandra Fire Artisan. Now, this one's going to sound weird, but let me explain. Now, Chandra Fire Artisan, we look at the card. Let me get a full image of the card. Here we go. Whenever one or more loyalty counters are removed, essentially there's that, but +1, X out of the top card of your library, you may play it this turn. Or you can just X out of the top 7 cards and you may play them this turn, which then the -7 deals 7 damage, yada yada yada. The reason why I think the synergy with Chandra and Fires of Invention is because, in a weird way, the factor that you have your second hand that you can cast cards from with Fires of Invention, like your main hand, you don't have to spend mana on those. So the factor is you can cast like a free spell from your hand without the sod, but then Chandra can be there to then be like, okay, I'm going to outside the top card of my library. Now, granted, you can't cast it for free because of the factor of how Fire of Artisan is red. Specifically, you may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana cost. Keep in mind, it doesn't say you may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana cost from your hand. So, it could also be the fact that it is still from hand. I'm not actually very sure about the clarification of that. But I do feel like, I'll look at it from both angles. Let's say you can't cast spells for free with Chandra's Fire of Artisan with Fires of Invention. If you can't do that, you're still going to have the mana that you're going to have untapped thanks to the fact of Fires of Invention, you're casting spells for free. So the fact that the Chandra of Artisan can be a way to generate additional resources that you can use the mana that you did not use for Fires of Invention just to essentially just have resource generation is absurd. Also, let's say then now, if it interpreted right, and you can actually cast a spell for free from Fires of Invention that you exiled with Chandra. Do I need to say anything more if that's the actual interaction? I mean, the factor is then you have access to being able to play the top card of your library for free thanks to Fires of Invention, though I keep in mind I don't think that interaction works, but if it works, that's absurd. That is ridiculously absurd. And I feel like you're going to see Fires of Invention and Chandra Fire Artisan have a lot more interaction than you think at first glance. So, Fires of Invention, really great Magic card, keep an eye out. Honorable mention, for me personally, I like Merchant of Vale, but I think the one that I think a lot of people are going to try first shot is, let's be honest, Torbran. Torbran is just a really good 4-drop for the burn decks like Cavalcade Calamity, and also like stuff like, hey, the Ironcrag, that when you draw a second card, now you're going to deal 5 damage intervals. Yeah, the factor that it's if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent, or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2. The amount of synergy you can get with that in currently popular decks in the meta is ridiculously absurd. So keep an eye, Torbran might actually see some play. There is the potential that it might, though, because it is this effect on a creature, and creatures can easily get removed, so you gotta keep that in mind. Still, keep an eye on Torbran. Anyway, now we go to green. And green has a lot of pretty cool cards. I'm not going to lie about that. Yet again, we're going to have to talk about one that I know we'll see play. Gilded Goose. 1 mana 0/2 flying. When Gilded Goose enters the battlefield, create a food token. And then it has the ability to either 1 in the green, tap it, create a food token, or tap it, sacrifice a food, add 1 mana of any color. So this is kind of our Llanowar elves that we're going to get for standard. And it's a Birds of Paradise as well, a semi-Birds of Paradise. So, yeah, those effects are pretty powerful in this creature. I feel like the most I feel like I already went to length when I did the review of this, but to summarize it, I feel like the ability of Gilda's Goose to help multicolored decks, especially to help cast early game turn 2 planeswalkers that are free converted mana cost, is going to be a ridiculously absurd effect that I think most decks are going to try out. Like, there is going to be people that are going to try to do the turn 2 Oko, but there's even more silly shenanigans like a turn 2 Teferi, turn 2 Dormry, and even just like the factor that you do have access to some very silly turn free plays, like even a turn free Rhythm of the Wild, so you gotta keep that in mind. Plus the factor that even it's a Birds of Paradise that has an insurance policy, so if someone already shots it when you play it on the battlefield, you still get the food token, which the food token does have synergies that you can apply for, whether if you're just going to use it for the life gain, or maybe with other things like if you have ways to interact with artifacts in your deck, so you gotta keep that in mind. Still, Gilded Goose is kind of a boring recommendation, but it is kind of one where it's a Birds of Paradise. And Birds of Paradise usually see standard play when it gets a chance, so keep an eye out on this card. Besides that, one card I would say to absolutely keep an absolute eye out, and this one I'm going to actually talk about for Pauper specifically. Losforeign Acolyte. 2 and a green for a Elf Druid that's a mana dork for any color. However, it has the Adventure Seasonal Ritual. 1 green for Sorcery Adventure. Add 1 mana of any color. I feel like Pauper Storm, while not totally popular due to majority of the Storm cards being banned, with the exception of the one that gains life, I do feel like this is a card that actually might make a Storm combo deck with that specific card kind of silly. Because it is kind of a weird ritual because it doesn't give you more mana for the initial investment. It's a filter rather than a ramp spell. However, there are ways that you can use that to your benefit. Like, for example, let's say you're playing kind of like a Gruul Storm deck and such, so you can do something as simple if you don't have your Manamorphose. You can just be as simple as just Seasonal Ritual, cast in, like one of the many one cost, like maybe a Diabolic. I always get the name of this card wrong. Not Diabolic Edict. The one where you get free black mana. I always get the name of this wrong. There's stuff like that. And even then, I think the factor that this might help multicolored decks in that format because the filtering aspect from this adventure spell is nice, as well as the factor that you do get the mana dork. So I do think it has potential there. Plus, there is a way, yet again, in Standard, that you can get multi-mana from this. Boy, am I foreshadowing that artifact. I'll talk about it when we get to it, but still, I'm going to sound like a broken record on that one. Anyway, the one card that I think people will remiss if I don't talk about it, Questing Beast. I think I already went over a Twitch video specifically about this card. Yeah, it's a card that will still see a lot of play. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with all that tats. Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste, can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt by a creature you control can't be prevented. And when it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to a target planeswalker that player controls. Ridiculously absurd. It's going to be pretty relevant in the current standard meta if it stays what it is as previous rotation. If it still sticks with the Planeswalker central value, this is just a very good efficient creature to help against Planeswalkers. As well as just a really good aggressive unit in itself. Plus, it's also a legendary creature, so it can synergize with Kefis-based shenanigans. So, like, if the creature dies, as long as it doesn't die to a lava coil, hey, you can reanimate it using Kefis. So, and also we have ramp, so you can get this out by turn 3. So, this card's gross. It became a little less gross when you realize we have a lot more efficient answers in the format to this than you think. But it's still a pretty powerful card that will see play. It's just absurd. It's one of the more push cards. It's really... Like, I could go on, but I'm trying to save time, but I think many people are already taught to death about this card, so let's just say it's good, it's powerful, it will see play. Now, my personal favorite card for EDH is the Great Henge. I mean, seriously. A 9-cost artifact that costs less as long as you have creatures, which if you're playing green, you're going to do that. And the fact of all those abilities are relevant. Add 2 green, you gain 2 life. Oh, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. I'm just going to say this. I am going to put this in a Yarok deck because I feel like the synergies you can do with Yarok and the Great Hinge is absurd. The fact that when a creature enters the battlefield, you then put 2 counters on it and draw 2 cards. I love that. Also, I love the factor that the tap ability, it works as a mana rock that allows you to gain life, which helps you against the burn matchups. It also can have fun synergy with Dawn of Hope, so you can actually tap it, get the green mana, just use it as a life gain, and then use that 2 mana to draw a card thanks to Dawn of Hope's ability. That's also something to consider, so... Also, I think this is just going to be an EDH card till the end of the days, because all those abilities that this card has is relevant to EDH. So, EDH All-Star here. Great card. Also, as I mentioned before, there is the 2-cost Legendary Knight, so if we want to do the Kefis Knight deck, that actually is a potential possibility. So keep an eye on that card. But besides that, we gotta get going. One click... It's hard because there's a lot of good green cards, too. Like, there's stuff like Wildborn Preserver, which automatically going to go into the Simic Flash deck. I mean, all those abilities are relevant. But also there's stuff like Yorvo, which is just a good free drop aggressive creature. Just, green has a lot of good cards. And then we're actually going to talk about the gold cards in the set. This one is a hard one for me because there's also just a legitimately lot of decent gold cards. Like, a lot of decent ones. Like, some of them are very powerful. Some of them are, well, let's be frank, we all have all the Planeswalkers here, so I feel like I'll quickly talk about each of the Planeswalkers since they are kind of some of the powerful cards in the set. Let's start with the one that I think a lot of people are talking about, Oko, Thief of Crowns. 1 green and a blue for a 4/4. 2 activated ability to create a food token. +1, target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk creature with base power toughness free. And -5, exchange control target artifact or creature you control and target creature an opponent controls with power 3 or less. This card's silly. The reason why this is silly is because Gilded Goose is a card, so the fact that you can get this out by turn 2 sometimes is pretty silly. And while the create the food token aspect of this is kind of meh, I think that +1 ability is nothing to underestimate, because you can both use that as a way to be both defensive and aggressive. One of the decks that people have been talking about around I've been hearing is kind of like a Sultai value deck, and it's running cards like Oko, Thief of Crowns, as well as it's also running cards such as specifically Dreadhorde Evasion. The basic synergy of this is mostly, how to put it, the fact that they use Dreadhorde Evasion to create the 1/1 token that you get from Dreadhorde Evasion, it creates the Army of Mass token, which gets a counter on it. So then, essentially, when that army token gets created, it's specifically then, when you decide to +1 with Oko, that specific token, you still get the counter still from that token, so you get like a 4/4, or even sometimes maybe even a 5/5 elk, which can be pretty absurd when you think about it. And that's just little things like that. Also, the fact that you can use this against big game threats is pretty nice. And the exchange control of target artifact or creature makes the food tokens have some relevance, so keep an eye on Oko. I do think this card has the potential to make a lot of standard impact. Well, let's talk then about the big boy, Garruk. Garruk, I like Garruk a lot. I do like the factor that it does make the tokens, and you can use it as a removal effect. And also the factor that the ultimate can be activated pretty easily. I mean, heck, the easiest way I could think of activating this ultimate is literally if you can keep it on the battlefield, Spark Double. If you go into Sultai, play Spark Double on Garruk, you get Garruk with Sit's loyalty on it with the Spark Double copy, just minus Sit's, there you go. And there's even other stuff, such as like with Evolution Sage, you play a land, then you play that land, you get the Proliferate effect, you proliferate Garruk, you get the Sit's loyalty. And I feel like in the decks that can provide a wide enough board space, you can actually do some potentially powerful synergies. So, I feel like Garruk has the potential, but there is also the aspect that we do have a lot of Planeswalker removal. Same thing goes with Oko too. We do have a lot of Planeswalker removal in the meta, so you gotta keep that in mind. But I do think all those effects are relevant in Standard, so I do think it has a chance. Then there's the Royal Scions, which these are kind of the... It's powerful because it's a free cost... Because it is a free cost Planeswalker. And I do feel like if the draw 2 cards is going to be a thing in Standard, it's probably going to be reliant on the Royal Scions. Now, the problem with that deck archetype in general, and with the Royal Scions in general, the +1 is powerful, the being able to draw a card and discard a card. However, we do have cards like Narset in the format, and Narset does kind of negate this strategy, and I do feel like Narset's still going to be a popular tech card post-rotation, even with stuff like Questing Beasts and such. So, with that being said, I do feel like if the draw 2 card archetype is a deck that they've been encouraging us is going to be a theme, it is going to be because of Royal Scions, because all those abilities are pretty relevant. Drawing a second card, thanks to the +1, relevant. The factor that then with the creatures you have, if you're trying to be aggressive, like let's say with Crackling Drake or something, getting a +2 and getting first strike and trample until end of turn, relevant. And then also the -8 is also just a powerful effect, even if you're not doing it for the burn damage to do lethal damage. Drawing 4 cards is a very, very powerful effect in Magic. You should never underestimate that resource generation. It is absurd. So yeah, Royal Scions I think is powerful, but it's going to be based on whether or not if a draw 2 is a deck is going to be a thing. And honestly, I'm kind of a coin flippish on it, though I am going to talk about one card that I do think will make that deck actually surprisingly a lot more consistent than you think at first glance. And the card I'm going to be talking about as probably the last card in the gold to keep an eye out on. I'm kind of surprised they don't have it here. Do they? Oh, here it is. Improbable Alliance. Red and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token. And it also has a mana sink to draw a card and discard a card. I feel like this card has a chance. I feel like the reason that the more I think about it, I do realize the fact that as long as we're not talking about Narset specifically, you can kind of do the draw 2 card archetype consistent thanks to stuff like the Royal Scions and the Tormenting Voice at instant speed and also like Opt and such. So I feel like being able to, and even creatures like Crackling Drake, etc. I do feel like the drawing a second card deck for is a potentially powerful archetype. I'm not sure if it's going to be a meta divining archetype, but I do think it's an archetype that can work. And the factor is that this can potentially be kind of like a Bitter Blossom that can generate you a token both during your turn, as well as potentially the opponent's turn to be used as a chump blocker. That's nothing to underestimate. I feel like that ability is very, very, very powerful, so it's something to keep an eye out on. However, if there's one weakness to this card, I think it's going to be the same weakness of the reason why we didn't see Firemind's Acquisition much play. It's the fact that while it's a 2-cost enchantment that has overall some good value generation within your overall deck design, there is the fact that Teferi is still in the format, and this can be bounced by Teferi, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. However, I do feel like Improbable Alliance is a lot more better than Firemind's Acquisition, because in the sense of, to put it in other words, with Firemind's Acquisition, you're going to invest a lot into it, and if it gets bounced by Teferi, it feels really bad. With Alliance, on the other hand, you're not like investing any counters into it or such. So, you can just as simply put it back on the battlefield, then just go into your drawing a second card shenanigans, and just build that engine right again. It's a lot more easier to rebuild back up that engine than it would be if you had like 5 counters on Firemind's Acquisition, gets bounced by Teferi, you feel really bad. So I feel like in Improbable Alliance, if the draw a second card archetype is going to be a thing, I think this card is going to be the essential blood for that deck to help keep it alive in the current meta. There is also potential that might not see play, but I don't know, I'm going to be optimistic. I actually like this card a lot. Besides that, I mean, there is some no-brainers here. Drowning the Lock is really good if you're going into the blue-black mill. Stormfist Crusader can be potentially very good in Spectacle-style enabler decks. Lockmere Serpent is just a really good control finisher. Dance of the Manse is probably going to be the last one I'll talk about in this, kind of like Golden Colors before we get to the next one. I love this card because I feel like there's a very, very janky self-mill deck you can do with a bunch of control-based enchantments, or even stuff like Rhythm of the Wild, where you can actually take this up to, like, say, make sure you get this up to the required sits, and then you can return stuff like Rhythm of the Wild and other powerful enchantments and artifacts. Give them all haste thanks to Rhythm of the Wild, as well as if it's multiple Rhythm of the Wild, so you can also put counters on them potentially, and actually have a funny, janky kind of finish with that. Will it work? I'm not sure, but I really, really want to give it a shot. Though granted, it also has potential application the fact that you can return control-based enchantments thanks to this card, and there's a lot of powerful control enchantments in the meta, so you gotta keep that in mind. Besides that, though, let's actually now get to the artifacts. So what is this one artifact that I keep mentioning that I think will make adventures kind of silly? Well, my friends, it is the Lucky Clover. Lucky Clover is a 2-cost artifact. Whenever you cast an adventure spell, instant, or sorcery spell, copy it. You may choose new targets with the copy. Note, those copies are free. This card's absurd. This card is legitimately one of the most absurd cards I have seen from this set. Because the thing is, how to put this bluntly. There's a lot of powerful adventure spells that we have that if you can get at least a second or potentially a third copy, since we have ways to make duplicates of this, using stuff like Mirror Maid or something like that, there's a way to get multiple copies of Lucky Clover. And if you can get like 1 or 2 additional copies, the amount of shenanigans you can do is absurd. I mean, like, let's think about this for a minute. Let's do a Magical Christmas Land scenario. Let's say we have, let's be just realistic. Let's say we have 2 copies of Lucky Clover on the battlefield. Remember that Rosephone Acolyte I was talking about? Oh, hey, that seasonal ritual now becomes actual ritual where you can spend 1 green mana and get multiple copies of the spell, which then allows you for ramp. Oh, that doesn't suit your fancy? Let's also talk about stuff like, say, the adventure, like, say, I don't know, maybe like Merchant of the Veil, have multiple copies of discarding a card and going through your deck. Also, oh, hey, stop, we're gonna deal multiple burn damage. I could keep going on. Or even stuff like if you're in a Knight-based deck, you can do something as simple as just Curry's Favor, have multiple copies of Curry Favor, and if you at least have 3 Knights on the battlefield, you can get a total of 9 life drain. It's absurd. And also, Murderous Rider. Oh, hey, if a Lucky Clover's on the battlefield, play that on turn 2, Murderous Rider on turn 3. Oh, hey, you can answer both their Planeswalker and their creature they probably have on the battlefield. It's just... I mean, maybe it's just my jank brain talking, but I feel like Lucky Clover just has the potential to do some absurd shenanigans. Or also the factor that, oh hey, if Lucky Clover's on the battlefield and you're in like a Reanimator deck, oh hey, now you can mill 8 cards, whether or not you're milling the opponent or needing to mill yourself for reanimation. Lucky Clover is absurd. It's one of those cards where I think the power level of that card will allow for some very janky adventure-based shenanigans. I mean, it's just... I don't know what more to say. It is absurd. Oh, and before we go on to the artifacts, yes, I do have to mention Once Upon a Time is also a good card that will be in the meta. I do feel like people have already over-talked about this card. It will see play in multiple formats. And also the fact that it's good for mana fitzing early game. Mana fitzing as well as getting early game answers in combo decks and such. But that one's a pretty easy one. Plus, I love the flavor of this. But going back to what I mentioned before, I just lost my train of thought there. But yeah. Lucky Clover, it's just... the amount of shenanigans that card is going to provide me when I do brewing on Tuesday. Keep an eye out on this. This card is very saucy in the right deck. Also, another card to keep an eye out, Stonecoil Serpent. X mana for a 0/0 with Ranch, or Black. Did I just say Ranch? With Reach. Though it would be kind of cool if the snake actually had Ranch, but no, it has Reach, Trample, Protection for Multicolored, oh, and it enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it. This card's really good. The reason why this card is really, really good is because we still have a lot of golden colors in the set, such as, or in the current standard meta. Stuff like Hydroid Craces comes to mind, and also stuff like powerful multicolor planeswalkers such as Teferi and such. This card is kind of an answer to those specific shenanigans. Because, well, it does die to modern shenanigans, granted, the spell I'm specifically stating. However, the factor is that this can be in standard both a really good early game and late game creature. It's nothing to underestimate. Plus, we have ways of ramping, so this can become big very, very quick. Yeah, I feel like this one is just going to be if a mid-range or even a control deck can play this. This is one of those cards I can see play in multiple decks, just because the versatility of the fact that it has protection from multicolor. It can be used as a finisher. It also has reach, also proliferate. It's still a mechanic in standard, so this can get incrementally bigger. And even if you synergize the stuff like with the Planeswalker from War of the Spark that makes your creatures with counters on them are Birds of Paradise. So you can even make this into a very, very big Birds of Paradise if you want to. Just, this card. I feel like this is one of those cards that you're going to see this card played a lot in Standard. I would be surprised if it didn't see play. Besides that, let's see. The one card that I would say to keep an eye out at the very least... I know it. Crashing Drawbridge. Hear me out. A 2-mana artifact creature with Defender. Okay, so it's a 0/4 with Defender. We've seen this before. Why is this? Hear me out. That tap ability. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. Okay, to put this in retrospect, the ability to make your creatures have haste, and this is a not color artifact, so you can put this in colors that in decks that don't have specifically haste enablers, like red usually has haste enablers, sometimes you see it in black, sometimes green. The fact that you can put this in decks that don't have easy access to haste enablers is a very, very absurd effect when you think about it. Because there's usually some powerful creatures in other colors that usually they are as powerful as they are, whether stats or ETB effects wise, is because mostly you don't have to worry about them having haste in theory. The fact that Crouching Drawbridge can actually just be used as a tap effect to give specifically powerful creatures in those specific formats haste is absurd. Like, to put it in perspective, let's say, imagine Doom Whisperer having haste. Imagine like a really big Stonecoil Serpent having haste. Or I don't know, imagine saying you cast a really, really big Hydroid Craces and then being able to give it haste. The fact that this card can be used in mid-range and aggro decks to be just help you win the game by just making a creature that an opponent has to answer right off the bat. If they don't, they might lose, is absurd. And even if it doesn't see that much standard play, I think in EDH it's going to be a very, very good card. Because it allows decks that don't have haste enablers, as I mentioned before, within their color pie, now have an ability to have that. Now, many people might argue, but we have stuff like Lightning Greaves and also like the Boots. Why do we need a Crashing Drawbridge? Well, it's the factor that it affects every creature you control. So let's say you're playing like Gave and you make like multiple like black-green insect tokens. The fact that then you can make those tokens have haste and maybe even finish off an opponent, it's kind of like stuff like that. I feel like this deck is going to be very powerful, potentially in EDH, but also as well as standard. If you have like a go wide strategy specifically, and you need a haste enabler, Crashing Drawbridge is just a perfect option. Especially if you don't have access to the haste enablers in red or in other colors that have them. So, Crashing Drawbridge, really powerful common when you think about it. So yeah, keep an eye on Crashing Drawbridge. Besides that, honestly, all the lands are pretty similar. The ones that I will talk about, though, I would say keep an eye on the castle cycle. I know the castle cycle is kind of unexciting because most people were hoping for the rare dual lands, but I would say look at all the castles at the moment, Because I think the one benefit that castles are going to have is the factor that they are really, really decent value utility lands. Like, for example, Castle Lucklane, the factor that you can tap it for mana, nice, but the fact that you can also tap it for 4, technically, if you include tapping the land itself, to be able to draw a card, that is absurd on a land. The fact that you have access to that free spell on that land, or even the fact that these lands in general have us access to free spells as long as we have the mana sink, is ridiculously absurd. Like, I do think this is, like, potentially stable variable, like Castle Lockframe has really good potential. There's also stuff like, say, the Castle Vantress. Yes, spending technically 5 mana to scry 2 feels bad. But if you're not doing anything, and you are, like, at the point of the game where you played all your answers and such, a late game scry is nothing to underestimate. There's also stuff like Castle Ardenvale, being able to create a token is just really good if you need a chump blocker or such. I just feel like those little synergies are something to keep in mind. And the factor is, the thing that I realize with these cards that make them powerful, you only need one of them on the battlefield to be effective. So it's not like you have to go like, say, oh, I have to have multiple copies of Castle Vantress, or I need multiple copies of Castle Lockframe. As long as you got one of them out on the battlefield, you still have access to that utility effect, and the fact that they don't have like a legendary clause, so you can have multiple copies, is kind of absurd, but not to like a broken extent. Also, keep an eye on the kind of the lands that have a type cycle as well. These ones didn't really impress me as much, but I do think they have potential to be very powerful because they are still, at the basic core, still a good land. Because, like, for example, Gingerbread Cabin. Oh, if you meet the certain requirements of it entering it untapped, you create a food token. Yeah, but still it's a forest, so we have stuff like Nissa in the meta, so Nissa can just make this into like a free elemental, or you can tap this for 2 mana, so you gotta keep that in mind. If there's 2 lands that I would say to keep an eye out for, one of them is obviously Fabled Passage. Fabled Passage, tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library, then if you control 4 more lands, untap the land. I love this card. I love it because it's kind of a way to give our current standard mana fixing, but still kind of balanced mana fixing. Because you can either use this early, it's still going to enter in tap, but you still get the land, so it's kind of like an Evolving Wild, especially if you have landfall-based triggers. But once it gets later in the game, the problem with Evolving Wilds is it's really good early game, but the later you play it, the more bad it feels, because then you don't really need the mana fixing. You would rather have the tempo of the land to be entered in and tap. And that usually happens by around turn 4, turn 5-ish. So the fact that Fabled Passage, presuming you have 4 to 5 lands by that time, the fact that then the land filtering you get can just filter a basic land out of your deck that enters in untapped, is amazing. I love this card. I do love the fact that we'll see play in EDH just because it's a better Evolving Wilds, or at the very least, it's a third Evolving Wilds if you need like a Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and now Fabled Passage. It's just a really good budget fetch land in the basic sense of the word. I love it just because I think it's a balanced fetch land in standard, so that's something I like. And another card that I think people would remiss me not talking about, Tournament Grounds. I feel like if a night deck is going to be a thing, it is going to be by the basic aspect that Tournament Grounds is a card. Mostly because a few things you gotta keep in mind. Thing number 1, this doesn't enter in the battlefield untapped, which is pretty significant. This allows to have a 4th land to help for mana fixing, and if we want to go into a Mardu or red-black or red-white or white-black Knights deck, they are probably going to, if you have like any Knight-based synergies or even equipment-based synergies, you're probably going to play Tournament Grounds. It's just really that effective of a land base. Multicolored lands, especially ones that enter the battlefield untapped, is nothing to underestimate. So keep an eye on Tournament Grounds. It's probably going to see a lot of play. And that's all the cards that, from my moment, I would say you should keep an eye out for the upcoming Throne of Eldraine set. Sorry if I kind of dirtled on some of them. Some of them I was just very excited about, while some of them, it's kind of was easy to see why it's going to see impact and such. Still, I hope you enjoyed the video. I now gotta do some quick things. I hope you all have a lovely day. Hope you enjoyed stream on Tuesday. This is LevDev, signing out.